Let's go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you and thank you all for being here. I'm S.J. Krasno, and I'm the Academic Outreach and Research Program Officer at the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research. I want to tell you a little bit first about what the center does. So the Center for Advanced Genocide Research is dedicated to advancing new areas of interdisciplinary research on genocide, as well as understanding the origins of genocide and how to intervene in the cycle that leads to mass violence. The center organizes annual international workshops and conferences, hosts a speaker series on genocide and mass violence, and has established a research fellowship program which convenes an international community of scholars, young academics, and students. In addition to the talk today, we have a couple of other upcoming events and things I want to tell you about. So we have an upcoming talk on Tuesday, February 21st. Professor Leanne Fuji from the University of Toronto will be giving a lecture entitled Everyday Forms of Resistance, Evidence from the Killing Fields of Bosnia, Rwanda, and the United States. In addition, as part of the Center's fellowship programs, we also bestow fellowships for USC undergraduate and graduate students and USC faculty for research related to the VHA, that's the Visual History Archive, the testimonies that we have at the center, or other unique USC resources that we have here. There's some calls for applications on the table back there, or you can visit our website, and there's a ton more information. You can always send us emails as well, and we're happy to talk to you. We're pleased now to introduce Teresa Walch, who is the first recipient of the Center's Robert J. Katz Research Fellowship in Genocide Studies. Teresa received her MA in European History with minors in Urban and Global History from the University of California, San Diego in 2015, and is currently working on her PhD at UC San Diego as well. She's also been the recipient of a number of prestigious awards, including a Fulbright, which supported her dissertation research in Germany. Teresa's dissertation in progress is entitled Degenerate Spaces, the Coordination of Space in Nazi Germany. And it explores how space played a crucial role in the Nazis' rise to and consolidation of power as Nazis, governmental officials, policemen, architects, and city planners sought to redesign space to fit their ideological visions. She will talk today about her research on the exclusion of Jews from public spaces, in particular stores, restaurants, buses, even sidewalks, and ultimately from their own homes. She came to the Shoah Foundation to explore what testimonies in the Visual History Archive reveal about Jews' experiences of this calculated, gradual exclusion. Please join me in welcoming Teresa Walch.
Thank you, SJ, for the kind introduction. And first, I want to begin by thanking everyone at the USC Shoah Foundation for your warm welcome the last few weeks. I feel very honored to have received the Katz Fellowship, and I especially want to thank everyone at the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, Wolf and Martha and Shafali and SJ for helping me navigate the testimonies and the center the last few weeks. So I'd like to begin today by thinking broadly with you about what Jewish spaces mean. Perhaps you saw this in my title and you're wondering, well, what does it mean if you say a Jewish space? So, for example, if I said Jewish neighborhood, what kind of images come to your mind? Do you start to see something that you would think would be in a Jewish neighborhood? Maybe you're thinking about a synagogue. Maybe you're seeing Hebrew or Yiddish writing on some stores. Maybe you're thinking of kosher delis, bakeries, restaurants. Perhaps you think of the people that are walking in the streets. What do they look like? Are they wearing traditional clothing? Maybe you see men wearing kippot. Here's one such example that I'm envisioning. This is a photo taken from a street in Brooklyn. You can see here, it's a bookstore. There's Hebrew writing. What we can assume is a Jewish man looking through the books. This is another one of a store selling kosher candies. You can see there's a Star of David on the meat and poultry store next to it. And an even further throwback, this is from the early 20th century. This is a picture from the Lower East Side in New York. Now, if you walk through Berlin today, it might be hard to imagine that such spaces also existed in Germany at the time. Specifically in Berlin at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a district called the Scheunenviertel. It got its name, it stands roughly for barn quarter, and it got its name because that's where the citizen farmers back in the early modern era had their stalls for their hay and their straw. But through rapid industrialization and urbanization, those stalls were forced to the outskirts of the city, and tenement housing was hastily erected here. And it became a site where a lot of Eastern European Orthodox Jews settled as they were fleeing pogroms in their homelands. So here's a couple photos of what that district used to look like at the early 20th century. This is another one. You can see it's a Hebrew bookstore. The Stars of David on the windows with Hebrew letters. A cafe. A small synagogue that was in that district. And finally, here are some people walking down the street of that neighborhood. So to provide just a couple of more concrete definitions, I define place as something physical and concrete. And a space then is those same physical places, but with all of the associations and meanings that we imbue them with. So a Jewish space, I define that very broadly. It can mean the specific spaces that Jewish communities built for themselves, so synagogues, maybe Jewish hospitals, homes for the elderly, and schools. It can also include places that Jews inhabited or where they worked, so their apartments, their homes, the stores they owned. And finally, it includes any places that Jews or non-Jews thought about as Jewish spaces. So these Jewish neighborhoods, for example, is where more or higher concentrations of Jews lived. And so that physical place of a Jewish neighborhood becomes a space when we start to attribute those various meanings and the things that we associate with it, like I described at the beginning. But the question I pose of what constitutes a Jewish neighborhood, of course, is rather a trick question, because sometimes you just don't know if you're walking around a neighborhood if it's a Jewish neighborhood. Oftentimes, Jews aren't visibly differentiated by the non-Jews who live around them, right? And this was the case in 20th century Berlin, or the beginning of the 20th century as well. So here's a map of the concentrations of where Jews lived in Berlin in 1925. You can see in the middle there's a rather dark area. This is that district, this is Mitte, and that's where the Scheunenviertel was located. And then you see some higher concentrations in the southwestern suburbs as well. And that's where many of the more assimilated German Jews moved to. These were usually middle or upper to middle class Jews. And Nazis saw both populations as problematic, but for different reasons. On the one hand, they despised the conspicuous Eastern European Jews in Mitte, who they saw as the cause of all Germany's ills. But on the other hand, these assimilated Jews who lived in the southwestern part became more problematic in the 1930s and 1940s as Nazis became obsessed with identifying who are Jews and marking them and their spaces. So as SJ briefly gave you an introduction to my larger dissertation and where this fits in, I'm looking at how Nazis rose to power and how they tried to consolidate this power within the cityscape. So when they started to make inroads into cities, they immediately shut down communist pubs, gay clubs, and cabarets. They destroyed Weimar-era and socialist memorials. They renamed streets. They conducted torchlight parades through working class and Jewish neighborhoods, and they bathed the cities in a sea of red swastika flags. Now, these were all perhaps seemingly minor, but I make the argument that they were in fact incredibly powerful ways in which Nazi ideology invaded everyday life. And these measures were also a powerful means of social control, because they visibly demarcated who and what belonged or didn't belong to the national community. So my larger project looks at these myriad ways in which Nazis sought to coordinate spaces to reflect their ideologies. But of course, such measures were most radically directed at German Jews, because it was only Jews who Nazis saw as irrevocably other and unredeemable. So they vandalized Jewish homes and demolished shops and synagogues, while German bureaucrats increasingly barred Jews from all aspects of public space. Willy Cohn vividly described this isolation in his home city of Breslau, writing, "We Jews get a very strange feeling whenever we walk out in the open these days. On the one hand, this is the land in which we were born, whose development we have pursued over the decades. On the other, we have been excluded from it and have been made alien. We are completely isolated." So in my talk today, I'd like to discuss two parallel processes through which National Socialist anti-Semitic ideology pervaded public space in Germany between 1933 and 1945 and transformed German society in the process. So first, I'll discuss how Jewish spaces were targeted for violent destruction from 1933 onwards. And I'm drawing here from human geographers and urban theorists who discuss how politics infuse the built environment. And more specifically, I draw on the work from Robert Bevan, who explains how in times of war, architecture and monuments and buildings that are associated with stated enemies are often targeted for processes of cultural cleansing. So today I'll highlight some of the ways Jewish sites were targeted for destruction and erasure in Nazi Germany. And second, then, I'm going to be looking at the ways in which Jews were excluded from public spaces. Now, many historians discuss space within the context of Nazi Germany, but they're often looking at their concept of Lebensraum in the East and their plans to colonize Eastern and Central Europe and to prepare the landscape for ethnic German settlers. It's okay, like helps with the, not to get too embarrassed. So this ideology of space and race drove Hitler's decision to go to war in 1939 and 1941, and it also propelled the Holocaust itself. And historians have begun to examine these geographical aspects of the Holocaust. They've mapped camps and ghetto systems, arrest locations, and train lines to the east. But the Holocaust wasn't predetermined in 1933, and mass extermination didn't become official policy until 1941. But one thing did remain a constant from 1933 onwards, and that was that Nazis wanted to make Germany Judenrein, or free of Jews. So I'll be discussing the ways in which they sought to do that in their everyday surroundings, and how Jews and non-Jews navigated this shifting terrain. So a brief note on sources. I'm drawing on a variety of sources here, from newspapers, from archival documents, both federal and local, so Gestapo reports and documents from Berlin, primarily from city bureaucrats, police headquarters, and the state court in Berlin. And I'm drawing also from the Germany reports from the Social Democratic Party in exile that commented on, gathered monthly reports on everyday life in Germany. And of course, I'm drawing heavily, trying to in this talk on everything that I've learned from the testimonies that I've watched the last 4 weeks in the Visual History Archive. But I'll be focusing primarily on the period between 33 and 38, just because of the limited nature of this, and then I'll briefly address the wartime at the end of my talk. I think this stopped working. There it is. Okay. So, when discussing the destruction of Jewish spaces in Nazi Germany, the most famous example, of course, is the nationwide pogrom in November 1938, when SA troops, the Nazis' paramilitary faction, and Hitler Youth set synagogues on fire and destroyed Jewish shops and homes. But though this was the most violent act of property destruction against Jews, it was one of many that preceded and succeeded it. Jewish spaces were targeted with increasing violence from the very first moments of 1933. Jewish newspapers, in fact, reported rather extensively on vandalism and attacks against Jews in the first few months after Hitler was appointed chancellor in January 1933. SA troops vandalized Jewish cemeteries and synagogues. They knocked over gravestones and smashed synagogue windows and graffitied them. Someone even threw a firebomb into the old synagogue in Königsberg, which exploded on the altar and set the curtain on fire. But they also targeted Jewish homes and stores in their attempts to frighten them. And several survivors remember having swastikas drawn on their homes and stones thrown through their windows in 1933. Berta Nussbaum's house was so badly vandalized that eventually their house no longer had any windows or a door. So she and her husband left Riena, the tiny village in central Germany where they lived, and sought refuge in Frankfurt. As historian Michael Wirth has shown, anti-Jewish violence was often more acute in smaller cities and in the countryside where Jews were more conspicuous. But larger cities were not immune, as Wolf Gruner's research has pointed out, especially in Berlin. Gestapo reports from Berlin in 1933 repeatedly mentioned violence against Jews, and it was especially these SA troops that would roam Jewish neighborhoods and enter cafes and harass or beat up people who looked Jewish. And the SA and police conducted a flurry of raids in, this is one example of graffiti. They raided the Scheunenviertel, so that district that I showed you at the beginning, and arrested and interned many Jews in improvised concentration camps. So it's important to note that in these early years, much of these actions were driven from below, from citizens by SA troops, and when asked about their first encounter with anti-Semitism, many survivors refer to these troops and Hitler Youth who would march through their neighborhoods chanting anti-Semitic slogans. They also remember the nationwide boycott on April 1st, 1933, that was largely enforced by these same troops. But it wasn't just stores, Jewish stores, that were targeted on this day. I heard the accounts of two boys who had their bar mitzvah on this day, and one of them remembers that around 11 o'clock in that morning that day, because it was a Saturday, SA troops, about 30 to 40 of them, surrounded the synagogue and began chanting, "Kill them, slaughter them." Now I want to mention something here also that didn't constitute vandalism or destruction per se, but was nevertheless a really powerful way in which Nazi ideology invaded public space. So when asked about some of their first encounters with anti-Semitism, survivors often referred to the Litfaßsäulen, or the news columns that would post news in German cities, and Nazis would often tack anti-Semitic propaganda on them. And they also remember especially the so-called Stürmerkästchen that showed the highly anti-Semitic weekly news organ called Der Stürmer. And you can see that obviously they were decorated many times with anti-Semitic caricatures as well. H. Henry Sinison, in his testimony, remembers these such news columns, and he says that they were full of cartoons showing Jews always big-nosed and greedy-looking, and carrying bags of money strapped to their belt and with some sort of caption under it, blaming Jews for this and for that. So here you can see one. Here's another example. And this is one example of what the cover page would look like. This is one of the most anti-Semitic, maybe. It's when they're discussing the so-called ritual murder when Jews would take the blood of Christian children and make matzot from them. And this was their slogan that they had on the cover of all of them, saying, "The Jews are our misfortune." And Gestapo and police reports stated that the ubiquity of these Stürmerkästen throughout all of the cities in Germany did indeed contribute to an, quote, aggressive anti-Semitic mood. And of course, SA troops, Hitler Youth, and other German civilians were invited to release this built-up anti-Semitic rage during the November pogrom in 1938, following the assassination of German diplomat Ernst von Rath in Paris. And after listening to testimonies the last 4 weeks, it's clear to me that this pogrom was much more violent and the damage much more extensive than most studies who briefly mentioned this night talk about. Jewish shops had their windows smashed and often were subsequently looted. Synagogues were set on fire, as we know, and men slashed, trampled, and urinated on Torah scrolls. But as Jewish men were rounded up and sent to concentration camps, the mobs also ransacked their homes with axes and sledgehammers. They shattered dishes and mirrors and threw furniture out apartment windows. One man remembers seeing grandfather clocks being thrown out of a jewelry store onto the ground below. Another saw a piano come crashing down, and he said it sounded like a bomb when it hit. And very vivid in many of the survivors' minds was also the fact that when they came in, they would slash the down feather bedding and pillows, which sent feathers fluttering throughout the streets. So they have very visual memories of that day. There was certainly a lot of plundering as well, but these accounts suggest that the November pogrom was largely about destruction for destruction's sake, and those who led it didn't primarily seek financial or material reward, and in fact, at least 174 people were arrested for looting. But that's of course debatable because 2 days later, the federal government fined the Jewish community 1 billion Reichsmark for damages. But regardless, I'd still maintain that it's clear that they wanted to inflict maximum damage. So in the weeks and months following the pogrom, the persecution of Jews intensified as the municipal and federal governments passed further anti-Jewish laws. So I want to shift gears now from vandalism and discuss the various types of restrictions placed on Jews after 1933 that isolated them, and then discuss how they and others responded to these measures. So this exclusionary process involved both banning them from certain places, but also marking and designating specific places for Jews and for Germans or Aryans. And as with the acts of vandalism, a lot of these restrictions were driven from the ground up, starting at the local level and then oftentimes being legitimated at the federal level. Again, I'm drawing Gruner's work here. He's looked at that in depth, especially in Berlin. Now, the absolute exclusion of Jews from rural areas began before similar measures in larger cities. Many towns actively sought to force Jews to leave simply by banning the sale of property to them or forbidding Jews to move to the town altogether. After driving all of its Jewish residents out, the town of Kefatal proudly erected signs to declare itself Judenrein, or free of Jews. And countless other towns erected signs such as these on the entrance to their towns, saying Jews undesired, or even Jews live here at their own risk. Now, due to this intense anti-Semitism in rural areas in the mid-1930s, there was an internal migration of Jews from small towns to larger cities. The Statistics Office reported that from the approximately 3,000 people who moved to Berlin between August and 1935, over 40% of them came from communities of 50,000 people or less. But Berlin wasn't immune to these anti-Jewish measures, and in spring 1933, Jewish organizations could no longer rent or lease municipal buildings, office space, or plots of land, and current leases were to be terminated as soon as possible. And by September 1935, many towns in the surrounding area of Berlin had passed ordinances so that Jews couldn't move in, they couldn't purchase property, they couldn't shop there, and they couldn't even stay overnight. Now, these Jews' unwanted signs appeared not only at entrances to towns, but filtered down to the most minute of city places. They appeared on restaurants, cafes, stores, and even, believe it or not, on some private homes. Survivors remember these signs well in their testimony. Rita Potocki, for example, summarized these developments. She fondly remembered the family outings that they would have in the new car that her father had bought in 1933. But she said, from 1936 onwards, quote, "You couldn't travel as freely anymore. Let's say you wanted to go on vacation, places you had gone to before. You had to think, would they accept the Jews? Would you be welcome? Would you experience anti-Semitism?" After they once had trouble finding accommodations during a trip to Berlin, they began taking along their own table and chairs and food, and they began having a picnic simply on the side of the road where they wouldn't be annoyed, accosted, or felt unwanted, as she said. And many families remember making similar alternative travel plans. But not all hotel owners banned Jewish guests at this point, and Gary Biggis, in his testimony, fondly remembers family vacations in 1936 and 1937 where they traveled to Woltersdorf, and there was a hotel there that still welcomed Jews. And in fact, he remembers that when they would stay there in those summers, over 50% of the guests, he estimated, were Jews. But throughout the 1930s, more and more signs appeared and local ordinances were passed that banned Jews from attending operas and theaters, going to movie houses, using libraries, and selling their goods at weekly and public markets. And in several neighborhoods in Berlin, they were banned from sitting on benches or assigned to specific benches that were painted yellow. But it was the prohibition of swimming pools, of going to public swimming pools, that a lot of the survivors remember as really harsh in their childhood memories. And when such signs like this forbidding Jews from entering pools appeared, it seems that most of them stayed away. One survivor remembers that she and her friends started going and swimming in a river instead. But I want to show you one really short clip from Harold Blitzer, because he remembers this, but he wasn't deterred.
And we would never, hardly ever allowed to play, and many times I used to smuggle my...
Yeah, me either.
And you can listen to the audio.
Anyone
maybe.
understand technology?
Yeah, it's a,
What did you do that when you started to?
I did. I
is it
just
on a
plugged this in.
PowerPoint slide or?
No, it's in the. It's on the internet.
So that's the.
It shouldn't have.
No, you just listen to it.
Just hear it.
Yeah, it's fine to just do an audio.
Listen to it.
It's more
But now it doesn't show my PowerPoint.
Right, that's more.
Maybe if I just unplug it. Let's try that.
There you go.
Let's try that. Is it still up?
Yeah.
All right.
Plug it back here.
Yeah. That's technology.
Very sophisticated.
Right.
Very sophisticated.
Maybe I'll just leave it at this level then, in case it was them making it. Okay. So this is him remembering he's discussing some of the restrictions, and this clip about the pools comes within that.
Grass and there was no maintenance whatsoever, and we were never hardly ever allowed to play. And many times I used to smuggle myself into these pools, swimming pools, and you have to take a shower first, and I was circumcised, so I had always walks with the towel in front of me so nobody could spot me till I put my trunks on, and jump in a pool. And
So another thing that many of us don't think about when we're walking around, right, is that Jews were very visible, especially in an instance like that. He seems to remember it rather lightheartedly and going. He was a kid, maybe he didn't think much of it, but he's somebody who refused to simply stop going. He kept going, but knew he had to be careful. All right, hopefully this works. Okay. And like their diverse reactions to pool bans, Jews also responded in varying ways to Jews' unwanted signs in cafes, bars, and restaurants. Some continued going, but might dress differently or try to behave inconspicuously, as some survivors said. Some were more willing to test out the gray areas where they initially existed. So Ruth Truyesh remembers that her parents used to go to their favorite dancing club. They used to dance weekly or so. When a Jews' unwanted sign showed up, they went a few more times after that. But then a Jews' forbidden sign showed up, and they stopped going altogether. Now, quite a few survivors in their testimonies say that they simply disregarded the bans and continued going. Fred Glazer said, quote, "Often enough you pretended you didn't see the sign. You went there anyhow," unquote. And for some of them, they intentionally continued going, and they said they enjoyed the thrill of such transgressions, saying it was like a game for them to play. But many Jews immediately stopped going to such places, either out of defiance, the "you don't want us here, then fine, we won't come" attitude, and many of them out of fear. Now, there are two things that struck me when I was listening to their reactions to how they navigated these restrictions, and two things that seemed to influence their decisions. And one of them was that a lot of survivors talked about their appearance. If one could easily pass as an Aryan, he or she was more willing to continue going to the places. But if one had a more Jewish appearance, then they held themselves back and usually stopped right when those signs started showing up. And second, assimilated families who identified as German first and Jewish second were slower to adjust to these rapidly changing climates. H. Henry Sineson's father, who had served 4 years on the Western Front in World War I, responded to the news of Jewish arrests saying, quote, "Pay no attention to that. They're rounding up illegal Poles and Russian Jews that came to Germany. They have no business here anyway." So Sineson's father said Sineson said that his father simply could not fathom that this right of being a German citizen was slowly being taken away from him. Now, not everyone who put up a Jews undesired sign was necessarily anti-Semitic, or at least that wasn't or may not have been their primary reason of doing so. Some did it because they were threatened with boycotts and social ostracism. But at times the Jewish customers would confront them about it. So after a Jewish customer at a restaurant in Kassel confronted the hostess about the Jews Unwanted sign hanging in the restaurant, she apparently profusely apologized to him and told him that he should stay, and that she was forced to do it. She had to. She had no other choice. And at times there were indeed consequences. There was one restaurant owner in Mannheim who received between 100 and sometimes up to 200 customers a day, he said, from Jews who worked at the stock exchange that was nearby. And he refused to ban them. But after that, a mob of people showed up in front of his restaurant, and he was eventually arrested for failing to conform and put up the ban. Now, many Jews responded to these restrictions by seeking refuge in the alternative spaces that Jewish communities and Zionist organizations provided. Jewish artists, actors, and musicians who were excluded from the Reich Chamber of Culture in the early 1930s, they then set up their Kulturbund, or the Jewish Cultural Federation, and they put on their own shows. So they provided an alternative artistic milieu for Jews to go and continue watching shows. Some Jews established their own cafes and restaurants, which the government initially encouraged at first. And synagogues, Jewish community houses, Jewish sports clubs, and haksharot, so Zionist agricultural training farms for people who plan to immigrate, especially to Palestine. These all became vital sites of refuge and of Jewish community building as the restrictions became more severe. Now, often explicitly anti-Jewish measures and sentiments surfaced around Jewish holidays. For example, Jews who celebrated Sukkot were especially visible as Jews. And for those of you who might not know, this is a holiday in which Jews commemorate the exodus from Egypt and the time they spent wandering in the desert. And they do so by building, there you go, a structure like this, a hut or a booth outside. They eat their meals in there, and some of them even sleep in it overnight. And survivors in their testimonies remember this holiday very fondly because children had a lot of fun decorating them on the inside. This is a photo from a children's home in Berlin where they're decorating the sukkah on the inside. But after 1933, it became difficult for them to continue this tradition. Samuel Geller lived in Chemnitz, and he said that his family's sukkah used to stretch the entire length of their ground floor apartment. But in 1933, they apparently asked every year the caretaker whether or not they could build it up just out of politeness. And the caretaker responded saying, yes, you may build it, but it can only be half the size that it used to be. And the next year, in 1934, his neighbors were apparently so upset that they had the audacity to build it again that they sent the contents from chamber pots crashing down onto the sukkah from the windows above. And in Berlin, the police were allowed to intervene in the sukkah building if the sensibilities of different-minded inhabitants, quote, were offended or if they disturbed the quiet and order of the area. Now, another survivor, Morris Hellman, they evaded such intervention because his grandfather owned the entire apartment building in which his family lived. So they built the sukkah in the back, and they invited the entire neighborhood to keep coming until they were eventually banned from building them altogether in 1939. Now, the other part of this development, as I mentioned, was the labeling. So the other parallel to the exclusion was the labeling, the obsessive labeling of Jewish versus German or Aryan spaces. As Omar Batov points out, quote, just as the Reich was declared progressively Judenrein, or Jew-free, the specter of Jewish presence seemed to haunt people's imagination all the more. So one way to allay people's fears then was to mark Jewish versus German spaces so people would know. So this is a sign, a German store that may have been put up. This is a sign of a Jewish store. This one actually comes from Vienna. And then later, and you can see this here too, in 1938, Jews had to add the additional name, either Israel for men or Sarah for women, if they didn't have a name that was recognizable as a Jewish name. And this is a sign for a doctor. And you can see they had the Star of David up in the left-hand corner as well. And to help ensure that Jews couldn't camouflage themselves within the rest of other Jewish businessmen, Jews were also explicitly forbidden from using the word German in their company names. And they were also explicitly forbidden from using signs on their stores that indicated their store was German. So Hans Zenger remembered that his father owned dozens of hat shops in Berlin, and the name of his father's company was English Club at the beginning of the 20th century. And during World War I, his shops were vandalized because Berliners thought that it was English-owned. So he changed the name to German Hat Distributor. But after 1933, Nazis vandalized the shops because he had dared to call them German. So he eventually changed the name to the Hat Distributor. Now, there were also unwritten rules and ordinances that governed Jews' movements in public space that distinguished them from their non-Jewish neighbors as well. So what were formerly rather mundane actions could now be politicized and be potentially dangerous for Jews. So many Jews remember when their friends and neighbors stopped greeting them in public. Even if they maintained relationships in private, they knew that it was dangerous for both of them if they greeted one another or shook hands on the streets. And it was very problematic for Jews to get caught up in something like a Nazi parade. One survivor remembers that when Nazis marched with a swastika flag, everyone was required to give the Hitler salute like you see here. But Jews, officially from 1937 onwards, were forbidden from giving the Nazi salute. So he remembers, he said that, quote, when the Nazis marched with the swastika flag, everyone was supposed to salute it. But Jews were forbidden to use the Hitler salute. And if you were present but didn't salute, people got angry and confronted you. And he said, the last thing you wanted to do was tell them, I'm Jewish, because that would have gotten you into more trouble. So he said in these moments, Jews would try to scurry away quickly, maybe duck into a doorway of an apartment building. And another survivor remembers getting caught up in these parades as well and said she would just try to scurry away as quickly as possible. There were also laws that related to national symbols and how Jews expressed their identity. Jews were forbidden from displaying swastika flags, which some nationalist Jews did in the early 1930s. They put them on their house or on their stores, some even on synagogues or Jewish schools, which then prompted the Nazis to ban them from showing such national symbols. And there were also moments of such symbolic visible defiance as well. 2 weeks after the Nuremberg laws were passed in 1935, Martin Friedlander hung this flag out of his window in the center of Berlin, wanted to express his Zionist identity, and it was a form of protest then against the fact that they had been stolen of their citizenship and the rights they had as citizens of Germany. So he eventually took this with him when he emigrated. Now, if we want to try to think about what effect this actually had on the population at large, reports on these that come from such organs like the Social Democratic Party in exile were at times contradictory. They concluded in the early years that they largely had little to no effect on the population. And following an uptick in persecution in the summer of 1935, most reports concluded that Germans didn't pay much attention to them and that they didn't actively participate in acts of persecution. It was just fanatical SS and SA cliques, they concluded. Now, of course, we need to consider bias within this report because the Social Democratic Party in exile would be more, they'd be wanting to highlight acts of resistance, and also the reports that came from within inside Germany were mostly from other social democrats who probably worked in these milieus that would be more anti-Nazi than the general population. But they did still report extensively on anti-Jewish measures in 1935, and they noted that while the population isn't actively participating, the actions have nevertheless left behind an impression. They may not support the Nazis' methods, but in general they support the campaign against the Jews. And by 1936, in January, the overall tone had completely changed. And the report stated that the existence of a Jewish question is generally accepted, and indeed, anti-Semitism has undoubtedly taken roots in broad circles of the population. Furthermore, they commented on the response of the Jewish community itself, saying that Jews are freely pulling back into a ghetto, and the attitude amongst them is unusually depressed and pessimistic. They only patronize Jewish restaurants and pubs, and in many cases avoid going out into the streets if they're not forced to do so. Now, survivor testimonies confirm this observation, as many Jews said they tried to be as inconspicuous as possible, and Jewish parents were especially keen to keep their children off the streets. Now, following the November pogrom, restrictions against Jews became ever more severe. So I'm going to zone in specifically on Berlin to really briefly summarize some of these restrictions that further isolated and ensnared Jews. Immediately following the program, government officials moved to quickly Aryanize the German economy and all remaining Jewish properties. So laws were passed in November, December that forced Jews to sell their businesses and properties for minimal profit. At the same time, the removal of Jews from their private homes accelerated. And many of them were evicted due to Albert Speer's monumental redesign plans for Berlin, in which he would knock down entire blocks of apartment buildings. And in order to compensate the Aryan Germans who had been displaced by his plans, he came up with the idea of giving them apartments that had formerly belonged to Jews. That then accelerated the consolidation of Jews who lived in so-called Judenhäuser, or Jewish houses, where they would often share one apartment. So individual families would have one room, and they'd share the kitchen in that same apartment. In May 1939, Jews were informed that they should not relocate to districts in the western suburbs. So if you remember the map that I showed you, and Speer's office soon declared those areas Jew-free, and he created a series of maps to show that. So this is the district in Schöneberg in Berlin, and the entire area that he outlined in black was slated to become Jew-free, where only Aryan Germans could live. In March 1941, approximately 60 to 70,000 Jews were still living in Berlin, and Goebbels and Hitler found this intolerable for the capital of the National Socialist Empire. And Speer, at that time, also wanted the 20,000 apartments that Jews still owned. So naturally, they decided to accelerate deportation plans for Berlin's Jews. In September 1941, they completely banned any Jews from moving into Berlin altogether. Now, as they were increasingly restricting Jews in place, we know it's well known that they were also making it increasingly difficult and then impossible for them to leave. They instituted a debilitating flight tax, and they banned transfers of money from Germany to other countries. And when commenting on this time, many survivors talk about, or they use words that indicate like entrapment or suffocation. Irving Lesch summed up this predicament of Jews saying, quote, "We didn't know how to get out. Like you have a mouse in a trap, you can't get out, and nobody opens the trap. It was impossible to get out, and people think the Jews wanted to stay there. Nobody wanted to stay there because it was impossible to live," unquote. And in October 1941, the government banned immigration for Jews altogether, and in that same month, deportation of Jews from Berlin to ghettos and extermination camps in the East began. So I want to conclude now, the last section, with the brief discussion of how Nazis and ordinary Germans handled the visible reminders of Jews and the empty spaces they left in their wake. Or to ask more broadly, how did the Holocaust affect the visible landscape and the built environment in Germany? Throughout the late 1930s and the 1940s, visible reminders of Jews were disappearing, which you could in some ways see as the completion of the destruction that I outlined in the earlier portion of my talk. Now, I'll give a few examples, starting with some of the bigger Jewish spaces and work my way down to the smaller. Perhaps the most obvious one is synagogues that weren't completely destroyed during the pogrom in 1938. Some of them were later dynamited altogether. Some of them were repurposed or further damaged in Allied bombing, and some were even taken down with a wrecking ball after the war. And most of these were not rebuilt. Cities across Germany renamed streets associated with Jews, much as they had in 1933 and 1934, renamed streets and squares that had been formerly named after politicians associated with Weimar Germany or after socialist politicians. Monuments associated with Jews were dismantled, and Jewish cemeteries were sold, closed, and in some of them the gravestones were crushed to rock. So I'd like to finally reflect on the most intimate of Jewish spaces, Jewish homes. And much like Jewish neighborhoods, Jewish homes often have distinctive visible markers that indicate that Jews live there. They might contain Jewish books, Jewish pieces of artwork, religious objects like Chanukkiot, Shabbat candlesticks, Seder plates, Kiddush cups. Now, by the time that most Jews left their homes, by the time they were deported or emigrated, many of these items were no longer remaining in their apartments. A lot of them were confiscated, like these pieces of Judaica in silver that you see pictured here. And after November 1941 onward, anything that remained in their apartments after they were deported or emigrated automatically fell to the state. And what happened with these apartments then, once they left, is that they were placed under the purview of Speer's building office, and he then in his office was in charge of reallocating them. He had to give permission for who could move in their wake. So I want to share one last story about the erasure of Jewish spaces by looking at one apartment. And this story comes from the memories of a man who was a young boy in Berlin. He was born in 1930. And due to German privacy laws, I'll call him Bernd. Now, his mother died when he was young, and his father remarried in 1941. And his stepmother was determined to find them better accommodations because they lived in a dank basement apartment. So in 1943, she eventually succeeded in securing them a spacious 3-bedroom apartment, and she also acquired furniture for a very reasonable price. Now, Bernd and his stepmother were overjoyed, but he noticed that his father didn't share in their excitement, and he seemed troubled. He remembers that his father knew that the apartment and furniture had once belonged to Jews. Now, as Bernd explored the new apartment, he noticed small cases attached to the passageways between rooms that contained tiny paper scrolls with strange, unreadable texts. Now, Bernd had, of course, noticed mezuzot, which many religious Jews affix not only to the exterior door frame of their house or apartment, but also to the interior passageways within the house itself. So he asked his father about them, and his father told him that these were Jewish good luck talismans. But they disturbed Bernd, so he decided to remove them. His father objected, saying, "You'll leave it be. One respects the feelings of others." "But these people don't see that," he retorted. "And if they return after the war, we'll surely have to leave." And his father looked at him and said, "Who knows?" But slowly, one by one, Bernd succeeded in unscrewing all the small mezuzot and throwing them away. And when his father found out, he was livid. He was sure it would bring them misfortune, and remarked, "It's shameful for our family." So just as Timothy Snyder and other historians encourage us to think about not the faceless 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, but rather think about the stories of the 6 million times one individual people in the Holocaust. I think that by focusing on ruptures in the urban fabric and the individual empty spaces left behind by Jews provides another avenue for contemplating and trying to grasp the enormity of what was the Holocaust. Now, Berlin's bustling Scheunenviertel no longer exists, but 7 decades later, one can slowly start to see signs of visible Jewish life. So I'd like to share with you a few photos that I've taken over the past year. This is close to that district that I just described to you. It's a kosher cafe, close to, if you've been to Berlin, if you know the Golden Dome of the Oranienburger synagogue. And you have to know that with the influx of thousands of Israelis who now live in Berlin, this is also bringing that back. So you can slowly start to see Hebrew on store windows as well. Here's another one. And this is on a cafe in that same district in Sun. It's kind of tough to see, but there's Hebrew scrawled on the window of this restaurant. The restaurant's called Yafo. So I want to end by highlighting two main conclusions that I think that we can draw from all of this. First, the segregation of German Jews and their gradual but radical exclusion from their homeland provided crucial antecedents to the Holocaust. Of course, segregation didn't make the Holocaust inevitable, but the processes of excluding Jews from public and private spaces in Germany and of marking Jewish versus German or Aryan spaces helped to construct the difference that's necessary to even begin imagining genocide. So in the process, the very diverse identities of German Jews was reduced to one moniker, that of Jew, and therefore not German, and something inherently and irrevocably different. Second, blatant anti-Semitism on behalf of Nazi party members, SA troops, and ordinary Germans was the driving force behind these exclusionary practices. But it alone wasn't sufficient. This othering of German Jews required a great deal of effort, and the breakdown of civil society had a lot to do with how Germans interacted with their physical surroundings and how they interacted with one another in public spaces. These interactions were political, and regardless of the intentions behind them, they had consequences. So I want to suggest here that the quotidian matters. It mattered that Germans and Jews stopped greeting one another on streets and in the stairwells of their apartment buildings, it mattered that initially hesitant pub owners eventually succumbed to pressure to put up Jews unwanted signs. And it mattered most of all that Germans abetted and accepted the radical segregation of Jews, whether due to anti-Semitism, indifference, fear for their own safety, or hopes of material gain. Because all of these actions visibly reified the belief that Jews are not and cannot be German, and therefore that they have no right to Lebensraum, or living space, within the national community. Thank you very much.
We'll do a quick Q&A if anybody has any questions.
I'll jump in. I'm still formulating this question. First of all, thank you for a really interesting talk. I really love the way you bring in the kind of spatial theory and the geography into this, sort of covering familiar ground, but in some cases anyway, but livening up with these very interesting perspectives. But so, one thing that makes me a little uneasy at times though, is I feel that you fall back on religious objects and religious kind of modes of being, because you present there are Jewish spaces, and then there are spaces that Jews and non-Jews imagined as Jewish, right? And so what is a Jewish neighborhood? It's one where there's a synagogue or a kosher butcher, kosher bakery, etc. And I'm just wondering if you could, how you kind of push beyond the religious in your definition, because it's not just that they're religious Jews and assimilated Jews. There's actually, as you well know, I'm sure there's quite a spectrum and many gray areas between these extreme, not extremes, but between these poles. So, and I'm also thinking, everyone asks about their own work, so forgive me, but I wrote about department stores, and one of the things that got me into it was that the department store was understood by many as a Jewish space, and both in positive and negative ways, although largely negative. And that, of course, is a space that has no religious connotations, right? Although some people do talk about it as a kind of temple or Jewish temple of commerce and consumption, but it's not, literally a religious space in any way, but it's seen as Jewish, and it's a space which department store business obviously really slowed down dramatically under the Nazis, especially when the war started. But those, in some cases, those very same spaces continued to, or started to exist again after the war, but they were no longer Jewish owned, and they were no longer associated with Jews by most people who went in them, or only maybe older people who remembered them that way. So I'm kind of wondering about what you do with spaces that don't fit into, the narrower definition of Jewishness in terms of religiosity.
That's an excellent question that probably I'm going to need to mull over even more as I continue writing this chapter. But I think it's great, and I'm struggling with that a little bit. As I think I'm maybe relying too much on the terms, which is a peril of all historians, and not to Germany, of their own terms, right? So what you see in the documents that they will discuss the very sharp divide between the religious Jews that they see in this district in Mitte and then the assimilated Jews, and they talk about better and worse Jews, right? And so the ones that were very visible, I think that's what I'm more addressing in this first part, but in the second part I really have to think about. I think that's why they became so paranoid about it, and this is what I'm trying to figure out in this part, is like, why did they obsessively start to mark these most minute of spaces? And I think that's because they were so afraid that they wouldn't recognize them, right? And a lot of Germans they knew that this stereotype of what a Jew looked like sometimes worked, but in many times didn't, right? And there's times when they would say to people when they saw them wearing the star, "You look Aryan, why are you wearing that? Take it off," But so the only way I think I can at least grasp onto your question right now is to say that I think that they also struggled with that, and I think that's why they started to mark them obsessively, especially in Western Berlin and other places where Jews weren't so visible. I just read this article by Omer Batov that I cited in here, where he was discussing labeling enemies, right? And he makes this point, is that because assimilated German Jews weren't visible, they were increasingly becoming more assimilated and therefore less visible, that created a crisis in Nazi society, because then when they wanted to identify an enemy, they couldn't as easily do so anymore.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right that there's this kind of fear of passing, right? And so the more kind of liberal Jews, you talked about Schöneberg, and I'm thinking, Platz or something, these are not Orthodox neighborhoods, but
Right.
these are, you'll find Jewish judges, doctors, lawyers, in very high numbers before the Nazis came to power, right? And so, but they may not be recognizable. Are those Jewish? Is that a Jewish space?
I would maintain that it is, because if, remember at the beginning I say Jews themselves didn't necessarily need to think of it as Jewish space for somebody else to consider it one, right? And because somebody else considered it one, that informed the actions that Nazi officials, that city officials made as regards that specific space, right? There was a reason that Speer included that district in that neighborhood,
Right?
right?
It's no
Because they
coincidence,
considered it a Jewish space.
Yeah,
So it's, yeah.
Can I, to push you even more, because
Please.
if you decide about a definition and you go with the perpetrator as defining the space or labeling the space, then you can go even further, because what is about all the Jews who are not Jews because they are Protestants, and then what is about the space which is labeled as Jewish space because some leftist artist is perceived as Jewish.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And so I think that's really difficult.
Yeah.
It's a challenge.
It's yeah. Yeah, you're exactly right,
I
because
don't expect an answer. though.
no, but it's, I'm gonna mark it because it's something that is so. I mean, as you say, in Nazi imaginations, anything could be Jewish, whether that be capitalism, communism, Marx, like anything could be subscribed. So I need to.
Yeah, stock exchange or something. Yeah.
Exactly.
I'll throw in hospitals and universities as Jewish spaces, in terms of how people perceive them, those Jewish intellectuals.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like Paul, I'm throwing my own work in here because I work on Jewish doctors. So I'm glad you had the shout out to the Krankenbehandler. So yeah, specific. So that's space marking in terms of their own practices. But what about kicking them out of general practices with it? Whatever practices they had in hospitals, and then limiting them to Jewish hospitals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And this thing that you're pointing out about professions as well, and professions that people associated as Jewish professions is also, very important.
Oh, I was just going to mention, not so much a question as much as it's an observation, that there's the first mode of trying to define Jewish spaces, but I wonder to what extent was it easier for them to define non-Jewish spaces, or at least declaring non-Jewish spaces as a way of getting rid of Jewish space, where it's just like, okay, we can't isolate them and we can't identify them, but what we're going to do is just say it's all Aryan, and then just leave it up to the assimilated Jews to self-police. I think of the panopticon is like everybody's watching you, and that to what extent does self-policing play a role, or that they relied on self-policing to identify people who weren't so easily marked.
What can you
Well, you have a bench that says, only for Aryans, and so it's up to you to decide not to sit on that bench. You're policing yourself.
Yeah.
Because you're afraid that you're going to, out yourself if you sit on that bench, because I think of Foucault as panopticon. It's just that,
somebody's watching you all the time.
somebody's watching all the time, and but you become your own policeman in that sense.
There's a really important observation you're making. I think it's something that was in my mind as I was watching the testimonies, but I hadn't described it the term self-policing, because you see that, and even as I mentioned the different responses that they had, it really surprised me on the one hand how many people kept going, even though they knew that they weren't supposed to, but then on the other hand, how many people they stopped. And one interview pushed one of the survivors at one time saying, but you it was illegal, like you couldn't go? She said, no, we just, we knew that we shouldn't go and they didn't want us there, so we didn't go, Mm-hmm. So this gray area that they had.
Because then you have those people who aren't going to play by that game.
Exactly. That's a really important point.
Yeah, it goes back to your work. It's these personal acts of resistance, and how did they manifest themselves? And so it's like,
Make a note of that.
I had a question about the testimony. So a lot of times when people think about the Visual History Archive, they think of it just about genocidal experiences. But as a lot of you may know, and as you point out in your research, testimonies tell a complete life history of life before, during, and after the war. So I want to know how important some of these stories were to you, to your research, since you're talking about life in Germany before World War II started, where I think a lot of times a lot of Holocaust testimonies start like right when the Holocaust started, but now because of the archive, you're able to find this researching these individual stories. I just want to know how important that is to you in your research, and how also if testimonies have affected your research and kind of changed your view of your dissertation.
Yeah, I mean, for me, obviously it's fantastic that the Shoah Foundation interviews don't start with 1939 or 1941, right? Because when I'm listening, I often, because of time constraints, stop listening at that point, right? Because I'm focusing on the time that's earlier, and some of the testimonies that I listened to, they emigrated from Germany in 1936 or 1937, but they're really rich in describing their everyday lives in Germany before they left. And I think that some of the questions that the interviewers pose were really fantastic at trying to get at that. Yeah, I think that obviously being here these 4 weeks has provided, hopefully this chapter, these parts of my dissertation, they'll be much richer because of the personal stories that I can add in. We rely right now in studying these on the sources that I mentioned at the beginning, federal and local documents, but primarily on also these overarching reports from the Gestapo, or on a few select diaries. And there are some good ones, but everyone's using those same diaries over and over and giving the same examples. So to be able to get a much broader scope has definitely benefited me.
You showed some slides of Berlin now and the different restaurants and other businesses that are cropping up. And I was just wondering, are those restaurants and cafes that are in Berlin now, are they frequented by the whole population, or are there Jewish populations there that are using them a lot? And then the other kind of question that I have is just if anybody has heard of any 2G or 3G people actually going back and moving back to Germany, moving back to Berlin or other places to kind of go back to their homeland now that things are different. I'm just wondering how things are now and how you see the future of people living together and building community.
I think I'll go back to some of the photos. With the exception of this one, so this is one that I don't know exactly who runs it, but it's associated with one of the Jewish communities. The other ones are all restaurants that have cropped up since this influx of, I think, tens of thousands, there's no exact number, of Israelis who have moved to Berlin. And most of them have citizenship from a European country from their parents. And so that's what allows them to move to Berlin in this case. But it's tough to give a number to how many are actually there, because they will register under their German or Polish or other citizenship. So it's a big question right now of the Jewish community in Berlin of what direction it's taking, but it's, as far as these things are concerned, it's very vibrant. And in the cafes, I've been to all of them, they're very mixed populations. You'll hear German, you'll hear lots of English, you'll hear Hebrew, but yeah, that seems to be, they don't, like this one, for example, this is a cafe in Neukölln, which is a district in Berlin that's heavily populated by immigrants from Arab countries, from Turkey. And initially people were really surprised when they put up this store and they had Hebrew so visibly displayed on the storefront window. They thought it might be attacked. It hasn't been, as far as I know, and I think that you'll continue to see probably more and more visible and vibrant Jewish and or Israeli communities. They're different things, right? Jewish community, Israeli community, but I think it's because of this influx of Israelis that you start to see more and more.
I wanted to come back to your remark saying this, the sources in which you're kind of understanding there. And I thought about this too when you mentioned the story about the sign in the restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
And that the explanation was that this was the one was forced to put a sign in there. So the question is, often we take, let's say, images as they speak to us in one way. If we don't know the story, it's really hard to tell what actually is the background for it. So when I use these signs, I often use them, sure, as kind of signs of perpetration. But I also know stories from testimonies, but also other documents, that the story is much more complicated. Some is also, the question is also, you mentioned that there was a fear of a repercussion. And sometimes it's the question, is this, where is the pressure coming from? Is it from local party members, kind of in a more informal way? Is it the city government who is actually ordering to put up these signs?
Mm-hmm.
And these are very different pressures.
Yeah.
And I'm not really sure what is actually the more forceful. Yeah? Is it the legal pressure of the city government, or is it the kind of potential violent pressure of the Nazi party members? But both are kind of in so far directing the space, yeah, and designating the space.
Mm-hmm.
So I found this a very interesting thing to think about. And just from the testimonies, there's this, because you said even in private homes, there were put signs on against Jews. There's this wonderful story I came across in the testimonies where, wonderful story, where a family loses their shop and they own still the apartment, but they had to hand over or kind of sell the shop in this house to an Aryan. And the Aryan comes in, takes over the shop, and then puts a sign on the main entrance of the house for Jews forbidden. And they still live up there. And the mother goes up at night and changes just one letter. It's then it's saying not for Jews forbidden, it's for everybody forbidden. It's in German, it's for Juden and Jeden. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that story.
That's a good one.
It's beautiful. Yeah, Ita.
I was just wondering, as the anti-Jewish measures were kept on being implemented, and psychologically, slowly but surely, which worked amazingly well for the, against the Jews, and then they started to, as you mentioned, the Jewish community looking inward, so to speak. The Jewish school, whatever space, Jewish space that they were feeling more comfortable being together or going to. I was wondering, did that not work against them? Because then they would just, what was the reaction of the Jewish community as the isolation aspect of it? And how did they deal with that? And how did that affect them? And in terms of life for them, and did it now get worse in terms of this isolation and just sticking together or looking inward to help one another? And I'm thinking of one testimony in particular that I'd be more than happy to share with you where that's addressed. This particular topic is addressed.
Yeah, I would like to hear from you afterward about it. I'd have to think about it, and I would imagine that it would depend on which one of these alternative spaces we're looking at, right? Secluding yourself, I don't want to use seclusion because I don't think that's the right word. For many of them, they were really, yes, I guess you could see it a little bit in the way of the self-policing, but in a way many of them didn't have another choice. So it was also a way to build themselves up or to network or to reach out to other people that they might not have. It wasn't just isolation, because assimilated Jews, who many of them say, there was one who said there wasn't a single person who didn't go to synagogue in 1939 who was still in Berlin, right? Like all Jews, no matter if you were religious beforehand or not, everyone was there. That's something different than, I guess, a religious space like these agricultural training farms that have a very productive purpose, right? It was you go there, you're secluded for the moment, but the idea is that that's going to help you get out, right? So I think we would have to think about which one of these alternative space we're looking at and what consequences that had
the
for
one
them.
that I have in mind, this particular testimony, it was in a school, a Jewish school, and many of the Jewish children who came to the school were so-called assimilated Jews. and then all of a sudden found themselves in that kind of situation. And several of them, when the parents couldn't work anymore, or the exclusion from work, there was no food, there was no money, and how they adapted and how they brought in food and how they, because they were feeling so humiliated and they were so unprepared to that level of not having what they used to have, how they would, if somebody still had food, would invite another child with no food in the house to their home. And there's a lot of the psychological aspect of dealing with all the anti-Jewish measures in terms of not only the psychology, but the isolation and what to do, and not to call too much attention because they started to be together more and looking inward, just relying on one another. There's one particular testimony I'd be happy to share that really deals with that aspect of Jewish space and what to do, and I'll be happy to share that.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that. Yeah, thank you.
I have another question. So since you focus on Jewish spaces, did you have a look into cemeteries? Because cemeteries are kind of from one very purpose are redesignated in purpose. Sometimes from the outside, but sometimes also from the inside. So for example, in Berlin, the one is the last kind of resort where Jews can play during the war, where they actually grow vegetables. I mean, this is kind of a repurposing of the very traditional Jewish space.
I haven't looked too much into them myself, but I do know that that's mentioned a lot in testimonies, and I know Guy Miron's article, he talks about this because Willie Cohn in Breslau in his diaries is talking about this significant role that cemeteries played for him and his kids, and he said that he used to reprimand his daughter when she would play in the cemetery, but then around 1939, 1940, he said, well, I stopped reprimanding her because that's the last space that she has where she can play in the city. Yeah, I thought about looking more in depth into one, but it's been done a bit, I think, at least by a guy who wrote this article.
But I thought for this late period, this is so striking that this in all big
it's true.
cities, in Vienna, it's crucial, Berlin. So in the big cities, this plays a big role.
Right.
At least for the very late period in 42, 43.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
I just want to comment that I loved your attention at the end to the spaces that were left behind by the people who perished or were deported, or that I thought it was very evocative, but also you used an example which someone had a kind of troubled, complicated relationship with the reallocation of that space, and I think there are probably equal number more stories of where that troubled relationship didn't occur and space was kind of cleansed or reallocated in a way that was not viewed as problematic by the people who came in later to inhabit it. But I think your attention to it is right on, and I'm curious to read more about it when you write your book.
Thank you. This is, yeah, this last part is something that's always captured me for some reason, but as a historian, those types of spaces are so difficult to access because there are very few written traces of that, right? So when I found this section from the memoir, I was just really so moved by it for some reason because there's very few things that let you get into an apartment like that, right? So in my wildest of dreams, I would imagine writing something that would be able to illuminate in more detail all of these spaces that I addressed at the end, but it's a matter of finding the written records for them that allow you to do that, Yeah. Well. Right. Thank you. Thank you for your questions.